From the intersection of 218 and 80, with the rivers like our own that seek for seas they never find. I'm Aaron McNally, and this is Curiosity Now.
All right. Hello, Curiosity Now listeners. Thanks for being here and thanks for clicking like and subscribe. With me today is, again, a repeat visitor, Matt Lewis of Matt Lewis and the News, the podcast, also the co-host of the DMZ, author of Too Dumb to Fail. Matt, how you doing?
Hey, Aaron. Doing good.
It's good to talk to you. I thought maybe we'd talk about conservative leadership in the form of a hero of yours. A whole chapter in your book, Too Dumb to Fail, is dedicated to him. Is Ronald Reagan guy. You ever heard of him?
Yeah, no, I wrote that on purpose, obviously, because Too Dumb to Fail is a critique of conservatism and the Republican Party.
Sure.
But there are a lot of liberals and progressives who have written books attacking the Republican Party. And
Of course.
I wanted this to be a little different, which is to say, this is a conservative who, for some of these writers, you have to go back to like Dwight Eisenhower to find the last good Republican that they actually liked.
Yeah,
And
right.
so my job or my goal here was to like demonstrate that this is a new phenomenon that we are dealing with and that I am a conservative. At least I'm a Reagan conservative.
When you say new phenomenon, you're talking about the phenomenon of liberal pundits kind of not giving a favorable review of Reagan or Republican leadership in general?
No, when I say it's a new phenomenon, what I'm talking about is that, look, there are people who want to say that the Republican Party is evil, has always been evil.
Yes, of course.
And while I agree that there are bad people in both political parties and all that,
Absolutely.
what I'm doing is saying Ronald Reagan, I think, was a great president. I think he's the greatest president of my lifetime. And then I'm telling the story. What happened since Reagan? What happened to the Republican Party? How do we end up with Donald Trump? And that's the phenomenon that I'm talking about. In other words, unlike some people who think the Republican Party has always been evil, what I'm saying is that the Trumpism, and I would throw in even the Tea Party into the story, as I document in the next chapter after the chapter on Reagan, that is when things went downhill.
Very interesting. I was thinking about ways that Reagan is represented, and maybe this feeds into what you're talking about. I remember there was, and I think you briefly alluded to this in the book, there was a skit where Phil Hartman played Reagan on SNL. And he sort of had this two-faced thing going on where he'd be given a press release and compassionate conservative and talking in frank terms. And then all of a sudden he'd have to have a national security meeting and the whole scene would change. And he'd shift from being this like down to earth, kind of like happy-go-lucky seeming, friend of Jimmy Stewart. Dana Carvey actually plays Jimmy Stewart in the skit. It's hilarious, by the way. But so there's this sort of public perception of him.
To kill. Yeah, it's
He
Dana
does.
Carvey. Dana Carvey playing Jimmy. You've changed, Dutch. You've changed. And Reagan's like, Jimmy, I'll have you killed. I know people. That kind of thing. No, that was a great skit. That was a great skit because every other skit about Reagan was just facile. It was too easy. It was he's this amiable dunce, as Clark Clifford called him. It's Reagan's this confused old man. But that SNL skit was brilliant because it didn't play on that sort of tired, obvious stereotype. It made a different argument that he's actually very smart and Machiavellian and that he's playing a role of this folksy grandpa. And I think that, although I don't think Reagan was the evil Machiavellian either, I think it's actually closer to the truth than the amiable dunce narrative.
He certainly knew what was what, and he knew who he was talking to, and he knew what they wanted to hear, but he also knew what he needed them to hear. And he had some ability to walk that tightrope and have an incredibly productive presidency for whatever agreements or disagreements a particular person's politics have with respect to the decisions he made, he had a very productive presidency.
Absolutely. And I do think he cultivated this all shucks image. In the book, I cite Bob Novak, who used to be part of this reporting team called Evans and Novak. And in Novak's book, The Prince of Darkness, which is a great memoir, if you ever have the chance, I would highly recommend it. He talks about meeting Reagan and Reagan citing like Bastiat and all these like economists and like just knocked their socks off. And then Evans and Novak, who had been like, reporters since the Kennedy administration, who were DC insiders, came out of the meeting and said, Reagan knows more about this stuff than we do, And I quote Fred Barnes. I quote Charles Krauthammer. It's actually an interview Charles Krauthammer gave to Bill Kristol's podcast, Conversations with Kristol, where Krauthammer remembered back, I think he was at the Washington Post at the time or the New Republic, but he was at a liberal outlet and he was invited to go meet with Reagan. And he wanted to like talk, foreign policy or find out about Reagan's, intellectual views. And Reagan kept talking about, movies and like, well, I starred in this film back in, and at first Krauthammer was very disappointed, like, this is like the most powerful man in the world. Why is he like, and then later Krauthammer came to the conclusion that like, this was a facade. Like Reagan is he wants to be underestimated or misunderestimated, as George W. Bush would later say. But instead of being upset, Krauthammer, I think, saw the brilliance there and kind of respected what Reagan was up to.
That's really interesting. I got a lot of different ways I could go with
the Western,
this. I think I'm going to...
The Western thing too. I'll just go real quick on this one. The Western image was also cultivated. There was when Reagan was running for governor for the first time, there was a reporter, I think maybe from the LA Times, coming out to interview him. And he was wearing like British riding boots and a helmet. Reagan was. And Lynn Nofziger, who was his press aide, said, you can't wear, go back in and put on some cowboy boots and a cowboy hat.
W tried to play that role, but to much less of an effect, I think. No, that plays right into what I was going to say was, I saw him actually when he was governor, before he declared his run for presidency. I saw Reagan appear on the Carson show. I didn't see it live at the time. I saw it in retrospect last year or the year before. And Reagan on Carson was really interesting because he played this really, like you said, very friendly guy, very just put everything in plain speech. And again, this is before he was actually running for president. He had an opinion about it. Carson didn't softball him in terms of like questions. Carson asked him like specific political questions. I think he was probably saying, hey, Ronnie, if you want to run, maybe I can, have you talk about some political issues on the program or something. And Reagan was very informed about a lot of issues, national policy, economics, foreign aid, all kinds of stuff. And he was already crafting his ideology. And it was really something to see that he could go on this public night talk show. I mean, Clinton and Obama were not the first guys to do that.
Yeah. Reagan was very, I think, underestimated when he worked at General Electric after his movie career was starting to flounder and he was sort of like a B-lister or a C-lister. He did this show called General Electric Theater. And part of the gig was he would tour General Electric plants. And he would get up there and do these Q&As where regular, like sort of blue collar workers would ask him questions. And so he got to almost do a focus group around the country of what every, sort of working class folks in different states were thinking, how they would respond to this joke or to this line and what their politics was. So he sort of did a focus group. Then after he, in the interregnum, after he lost, he runs for president in 1976 and then loses. The the primary
Oh,
narrowly.
he loses the primary. Okay, I
Yeah,
didn't know that part of the story.
yeah.
Okay.
He ran. So in '76, Reagan ran against Gerald Ford, the incumbent president.
Okay, it might be that he had already done that when I saw him talk to Johnny Carson, possibly.
Yeah, and there's
But
a
go
great
ahead.
book. There's a great book called Reagan's Revolution by Craig Shirley about the
Uh-huh.
'76 run that I would highly recommend. But between '76 and '80, Reagan did like a radio show every day, and he wrote the stuff himself. Like he didn't have writers. Like he basically wrote the radio scripts himself, and it was very intellectual, very policy oriented, and he covered essentially every important public policy issue in those 4 years. So he really was boned up on the issues.
That wasn't the GE show. What show was that?
This is different. This was a radio commentary show he would have on the radio where he would talk. That's
Let me see if I
after,
can dig
yeah,
any of that up.
yeah. There's actually, well, I know there's a book. There's a book about the General Electric years. There's a book specifically about it. There's another book called Reagan in His Own Hand, which has handwritten notes that Reagan wrote. I think there probably are some of the radio scripts I'm thinking are probably in that book as well. There's probably also like love notes he wrote Nancy and things like that as
Mhm.
well in there.
Praise be to-
But he wrote them himself in that case. And later, obviously, he would have, great speechwriters like Peggy Noonan helping craft his words. But at this point, he was writing his own speeches and just very underestimated in terms of his knowledge.
Yeah, and then so we lost that primary, but the next time around, he got the Republican nomination. I did some Matt Lewis style research this weekend.
Which means you're winging it, basically.
No. I'll tell you what it means. It means that I talked to my mom.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I called up my mom, and my mom has voted Democrats, Bill Clinton twice, Barack Obama twice. I'm sure she voted for Kerry, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden. But her first two presidential elections, she voted for Reagan both times. And I called her and I talked to her about it, and I just kind of was trying to get the vibe of what everything was like. She was a young mother. I was about 6 months old when she voted for Reagan. Her and my dad had been married for just a short time. They had a small house, they were coming out of the 70s, and I kind of asked her about, the gas rationing and some economic stuff, and just trying to get a sense of like, what was she, and she says kind of the conventional things that you'd expect somebody to say, that, Reagan was very charming and very charismatic. And she said, I thought he seemed like a very good man. That was very important. She also said she thought Jimmy Carter seemed like a very good man. But I said, but she thought Reagan could handle things a little better. And she,
Yeah.
yeah, I must have. Now, and she confessed that she didn't know. I asked her about the, if the hostage situation had played into it or some of the political issues of the day. And she said, I was young. I wasn't really paying close attention to policy, but obviously Reagan had the ability to come in with that charm, with that charisma, with that everyman kind of friendly quality. But when you compare him to somebody like Carter, he pretty handily won against somebody who would go on to vote for Democrats the rest of her life. So it's partly that balance of the charm, the charisma. Oh, and by the way, she said, I knew him from TV, of course, because he was on some cowboy show on TV. I can't remember the name of it. She told me, but so something about that pop media celebrity mixed with the charm and charisma, mixed with the intelligence about issues. In a lot of ways, he was just like the
and you can see how people. I know we've promised not to mention a certain president's name, so I won't. But but you could see like the TV familiarity, the movie star thing could be compared.
Major asset, yeah.
But on the other hand, I think Reagan had something that that a certain president we won't mention didn't have, which is like the decency, the character, and I think Donald. I almost said his name. I think the president, whose name I'm not going to say, is obviously very intelligent, but not learned, not wise, not was not educated on the issues. Reagan was. Reagan took the time to be educated on the issues. So I think Reagan had the character and the character and the knowledge, but there's no doubt that the acting, both in terms of stylistically,
Mhm.
like what being trained as an actor helps you do, as
Mhm.
well as the name recognition and the face recognition, the fact that he was a known commodity. Like I think all of those things intersected and
Mhm.
certainly benefited him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I wanted to bring up, while we're on the topic of leadership, that's another Matt Lewis topic.
Yes. And
So
let
I
me
had
let me recommend Reagan on Leadership, which is by my good friend James Strock. It's a very concise read, and it's very good.
what's that last name? Strock, ST.
Yeah, Strock, James Strock, good friend of mine. He worked for Reagan. He also was at one point he was the head of the California EPA, and he
Oh.
has a book. He has Theodore Roosevelt on leadership and Reagan on leadership.
Mhm. Well, anyway, it's Black History Month, and we had a really tumultuous year last year. And my company that I work for had a diversity inclusion meeting yesterday, where we had some uh, representatives talking about issues, and they got to talking about leadership because they were all seen as members of the Black and or African American leadership within our corporation. And one of the gentlemen on that panel said some really nice things about how he defined leadership that I thought were really appropriate here. Um, First off, he said that you had to have an authenticity about yourself. You needed to be real. You needed to be authentic. And how do you get that authenticity? And he said you have to be honest, right? You also have to cultivate sincerity. And as you're being honest and cultivating sincerity, you have to be willing to talk about uncomfortable things. But, and this was the key for him, you have to remain positive despite the fact that you're being honest and sincere. And then on top of that, to actually draw all those qualities in as like a communicator and a representative of the truth, then you also have to be able to look for the potential in every human being that comes into you. So you're not rejecting any of the people, just unlike some people we know who are bad leaders. How does that fit the description of Reagan for you?
I think it fits it very well. Any politician at the presidential level is going to be, scripted to a certain extent. They're going to, have writers. They're going to have messaging, how to stay on message. But if you read about Reagan, one of his lessons from being an actor is that you had to be real. He had this sort of reverence for the camera, and that the camera could spot
Mm-hmm.
phoniness. And
Sure.
so you had to actually be sincere and really mean it. Um, and I also think the optimism part obviously shines through. Reagan was a sunny, optimistic conservative, which was maybe now sounds like a cliche, but at the time it was actually a pretty novel innovation. If you think about it, conservatism would normally think like, oh, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. Everything's so horrible.
Mm-hmm.
Things are out of control. Reagan believed that our best days were ahead of us. And he even quoted Tom Paine, which is, we have the ability to remake the world over. And that was a very controversial thing to say to conservatives because, Tom Paine and Edmund Burke they were friends during the American Revolution, but during the French Revolution, they became the best of enemies, basically. And so to quote Paine as a conservative, Paine was obviously a radical revolutionary, to quote Paine was not normal, certainly at the time. So Reagan had that bias. And I think some of it was when Reagan grew up, his hero was Franklin Roosevelt. Reagan
Mm-hmm.
grew up as a Democrat, and FDR was his hero. And FDR talked about, having a rendezvous with destiny, and we have nothing to fear but fear itself. So I think some of that came from Reagan's upbringing.
That segues nicely. I recently watched a, a documentary on the life and work of the economist Thomas Sowell, and he was saying of Reagan, he was like, he was so far left, he was on the FBI list, like at some point. Now, I don't know if that's true or if you read anything about that on the in the biographies that you've read on Reagan, but FDR, public program, New Deal kind of guy. How far left was Reagan as far as social policy before he moved to the right?
Well, look, so I do know Reagan. Reagan was head of the Screen Actors Guild during a time when there was like a concerns about communist infiltration, and Reagan was anti-communist even back then. But so was John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, of course.
Reagan campaigned for Harry Truman, who supported universal health care. So I think that Reagan could have definitely been considered a liberal Democrat. Even as a Republican governor of California, he supported things like abortion, which later Reagan became pro-life. Reagan also supported. There was an effort to make it illegal in California for gay people to be teachers, and Reagan opposed that very famously. Reagan opposed that, I believe, when he was a Republican, but at the time that would have been seen as a pretty bold thing for a Republican to support. So,
hell, even for a Democrat.
Yeah, you're right. But it was a different world too. Like I said, here's one of the really interesting things to think about when you're thinking about Reagan, is that he was older than John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon.
Oh, that's kind of surprising. Interesting.
Yes. So when you think about the generational aspect of Reagan, like what the world he grew up in and what the world was like when he was growing up, it's important to remember he was actually older than John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, who were, Kennedy was president 20 years before Reagan. But Kennedy was, like the youngest president, and Reagan was like the oldest. So that's why.
Interesting. So what do you think did lead to his movement into the conservative realm? Was it just direct experience? He'd campaigned for politicians, or was it his gubernatorial experience that he just saw the inefficiencies of government, and he saw some of the inefficiencies of the systems of power, and therefore just simply changed his perspective because of factual evidence, or what was it?
People debate this. I don't think there's a clear answer. I think it's a combination of things. One, the Democratic Party radicalized. Reagan said, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me." The Democratic Party.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, me too. Or at least
you do from the other side.
Yeah. But so the Democratic Party radicalized after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. When Kennedy's out of the way, Kennedy cut taxes. He was a Cold Warrior, anti-communist. And so that's in like the early 60s. By the late 60s, you've got all sorts of radical the protest movement on college campuses, the culture, there's just a cultural upheaval in America. And the left is very much front and center. So I would say that part of what happened is just the 60s.
Sure.
So that's part of the story. There's also some thought that Nancy Reagan's father, who was a Republican, might have influenced Nancy, and her dad might have influenced Reagan to become Republican. Also, I think his battles with communism, and they threatened to. I mean, there were death threats on Reagan from the communists when he was in Hollywood. So I think all of those things sort of conspired to make him become a Republican.
Yeah. So speaking of that whole, radicalization and just basically the shift in public perception about government after Vietnam and just
Yeah.
a lot of things, were happening. And I came up, like I said, I was born the year that my mother voted for Ronald Reagan for president. So he was like, I was not a fully conscious Homo sapien when he was actually in the presidency. And I didn't really have opinion this way or that way about him. He was the friendly president that was on the TV when I was a kid, And I remember him speaking when the astronauts died and, all this stuff. And um, then, like so many young people, I went to university, and just about every opinion of Reagan I heard was ambivalent at best, but in other cases just vindictive about him. Was that all just radicalization, or was there credo about that? And I might ask you about a couple of specific examples, but first off, just some general thoughts.
So it is weird when you think about where we're at today. I'm sure people who hated Reagan at the time would like die for Ronald Reagan, if Reagan had been president the last 4 years, I mean, I realize the man's been dead now for 15 years, but but if the Reagan of 1980 were president, then so I think part of it's our perspective has changed over time. And people like Bruce Springsteen were very hostile to Reagan in the 80s. Reagan kind of co-opted that Born in the USA song, which is ironic,
Mhm.
right? Because it's not really a patriotic song.
It's really not. No.
It's more like a protest song. But people like Bruce Springsteen, I think probably today would be, I'm guessing, I don't know, I'm guessing he would be more kinder to Reagan. In hindsight, I think Reagan is the most the greatest president of my lifetime, and the reason I say that is that he really faced two huge challenges. So one is, we've talked about it a lot, but the Cold War. I mean, we were in this existential struggle with the Soviet Union. They were pointing nuclear weapons at us. We were pointing nuclear weapons at them. And Reagan comes in and basically ends that war, basically wins it. And so that, I think, is just, those are points on the scoreboard. I mean, nobody thought he was going to be able to do that. So we win the Cold War. That's huge. He's in Cooperstown for that. The other thing is that when Reagan came in, there was this term, malaise, the so-called malaise speech that Jimmy Carter gave. There's, the world is too big for one president. Maybe America needs two presidents. We can't heat the house. You don't want your house to be at 72. You got to put on a cardigan and turn the heat down. So, there was sort of a defeatist attitude, a little bit of a depressing vibe in America in the 70s. A pretty big depressing mood in the 70s, actually. And Reagan comes in and I think restores hope and optimism in America. And so those two things, beating the Soviet Union, winning the Cold War, defeating communism, and restoring faith and optimism and hope and energy and belief in America, that's a career. That's Cooperstown. And so that's why. But there's a lot of stuff that happens in 8 years. And there's always going to be bad stuff that happens on your watch if you're there for 8 years.
Absolutely. And I was thinking too, like, a lot of liberals resent the fact that Bill Clinton kind of inherited his lexicon for how to talk about liberalism from the Reagan era. And Reagan had, come in on a platform of, let's reform this thing. It's inefficient, it's overspending, let's reform it. And so Clinton had to play to that way of depicting liberalism, that liberalism is wasteful, that liberalism is culturally destructive, possibly degenerate, and all these things. And so people resent that Clinton had to go into that realm to become a winner.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but there's another side to that coin, and that is that Clinton also inherited from Reagan this optimism you're talking about. This, you've got to come in with a good attitude about the country and really pitch it as though we're going somewhere, and contextualize the struggles we're going through, and try to see a light at the end, and
Yeah.
move towards that. I think that he inherited, for anything that you might dislike about his policies, he definitely inherited that philosophy from Reagan, I think, and political
Totally.
strategy.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. One, as I mentioned earlier, Reagan inherited stuff from FDR. And
Exactly. Yeah.
so if you're smart, you do steal from the other side and
Hmm.
adapt. So I don't think it's, I think Bill Clinton was smart, and Bill Clinton won. I mean, Jimmy Carter lost, Walter Mondale lost. Um, Democrats had a good run of losing. Michael Dukakis lost, and
Hmm.
then Bill Clinton changes and takes a page from the Gipper. Now, I do think that there is an important point that needs to be made, though, is that in general, I believe in optimism and positivity, but I also believe. I just interviewed this guy named Trevor Moad, who's a
Hmm.
sports motivator, and he preaches this thing called neutral thinking,
Oh.
which is not positive thinking and it's not negative thinking; it's neutral thinking. And it's a nuance, but it's basically being realistic with a positive spin,
Hmm.
but not being delusional. You have to be realistic about where we actually are. It's important to remember what happened to America before Reagan came in. We've touched on this a little here, but there was the Vietnam syndrome. There was a sense that America's best days were behind. There was the Vietnam thing, obviously. There was, remember the hostage rescue attempt.
Hmm.
Um, and where our planes went down in Iran. There was uh, America needed an optimist at that point. Now
Hmm.
it may be that there's a time for a realist, though, right? I'm not saying that
Hmm.
you always should be like everything's great even if it's not, but I think in 1980 we needed someone to say it's going to be okay. Trust me, I got this. We're Americans. We kick ass. We can do this. We needed to hear that. And there may come a time when we need someone to tell us, you know, you need to check yourself a little bit, right? So Reagan was at the right message at the right time.
Sure thing. So speaking of all these things that he inherited, all right, geopolitics, you know, you mentioned Eisenhower being thought of favorably or whatever, but Eisenhower was describing a problem in the military industrial complex that he himself was a part of, the era that ushered it in. And geopolitics, in how we were dealing with our relationships with the Soviet Union, led to a lot of interactions with smaller countries in Central America and all sorts of places. And Reagan walked into that and had to make deals with the way the scene was. And he gets a lot of flack for something about the CIA paying off some people who were letting cocaine into the United States or something. And a lot of people are really upset because they think that fostered the crack epidemic in Black communities. And I'm not 100% convinced that that was anything intentional that Reagan actually did per se, and wasn't a collateral damage thing from the political play. And I have not researched this extensively, I
There's a
guess.
Tom Cruise movie about it,
Yeah.
by the way. It's pretty good. Um,
But anyway, so how do you deal with that? Like, some people are just like, Reagan didn't care about Black America. Reagan let a lot of Black people really suffer. What's what's going on there? Where's that animosity coming from? Is that just the way it's going to be towards any conservative president, or was it just the state of affairs, or what do you think about these issues?
I mean, there's
I just conflated two things, obviously. International affairs with how it had to go with funding certain different types of warlords, and I mixed that in with genuine humanitarian concern about our own minority populations. But go ahead and see
yeah.
if you can unweave them.
there's a lot there, and I don't know everything about all of it. But I think, let's see where to begin. So I think clearly Reagan decided that he wanted to use American military to exert strength, and he wanted to beat the communists, but he didn't want to get bogged down in another Vietnam, because that would actually be counterproductive,
Mhm.
in terms of that would hurt American morale, and it would
Mhm.
help the communists. So instead, he engaged in these like little surrogate wars where he would fund,
Mhm.
the Contras, or what, these different groups, freedom fighters as they were called. So that is in and of itself is sort of a controversial strategy.
Mhm.
And I guess my argument would be there, like, you have to break some eggs to make an omelet. Like Ray, is it? I'm sure that some of the people America funded that he was calling freedom fighters were very unsavory people.
Mhm.
We were doing it to win the Cold War, to stop the spread of communism without a large footprint, without America getting bogged down. So it was messy. Again, I think if you're around for 8 years, there's going to be some things that happen. I know that there is a conspiracy theory that suggests that like the CIA created crack cocaine and put it in the inner cities specifically to hurt the African American community. Uh, my belief is that that's like a crazy conspiracy theory.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, what I do think happened, and a lot of my knowledge is based on a Tom Cruise movie that may or may not be apocryphal, but it does seem like, some of the people that like Oliver North was empowering to, basically, uh, take weapons to South America and things like that, were bringing back drugs.
Mhm.
And I don't think Reagan was. I don't think Reagan was like ordering that, but
Yeah.
it happened. Like that kind of stuff like happened on his watch, and so at some point, you are culpable to a certain degree. But I don't think Reagan was aware of that, or I don't think that was like the Phil Hartman
Yeah.
Machiavellian
Yeah.
Reagan there.
There's a reason that was a comedy bit, right? And I don't mean to give oxygen to conspiracy theories either. I just thought it was useful to talk about something like this. And I think we're going through an interesting era where, post WikiLeaks, there's just the way we look at the elites on the geopolitical scene, there's a lot of warranted skepticism on the part of the populace. And I don't personally, gosh, now I'm going to sound like I'm philosophizing, but I don't personally want to see that come into a position where we just have nothing but ill will and bad faith about our leaders, because we've seen
Yeah.
recently how that's not helped us. It's not been in our interest to think that way. So I'd just kind of want to, put, uh, hang up the laundry and open the doors, and let a little air in the room about how we talk about that kind of stuff. uh, you know, a lot happened geopolitically after World War II. There were a lot of concerns globally. We're not out of the thick yet, but I think,
Yeah.
we would do well to
Right.
look
And I
at,
think,
look at why we're so cynical and test some of those
yeah.
assumptions.
I mean, I think in Reagan fashion, we need to do a better job of celebrating our victories and our
Mhm.
heroes, and not trying to tear everybody down. But by the same token, um, I will engage in neutral thinking, and just being
Sure.
real. And like I said, every presidency is going to have, you know, there's like John F. Kennedy with the affairs, um,
Hmm.
John F. Kennedy with starting the Vietnam War, um, John F. Kennedy, and and probably this happened later, maybe with Lyndon Johnson, who had his own issues too. We have an airport, 45 minutes from where I'm sitting now, called Dulles Airport. And Dulles he was a pretty bad guy. And in fact, he was involved in the, is it MK Ultra? Or I'm trying to think of the name of the mission, where they would basically give people LSD, like inmates and stuff, and do psychological experiments on people without their permission in America. This isn't in Germany, in America, right? Like effed up stuff has happened.
Yeah.
And so
Woodrow Wilson and his eugenics and all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
So yeah, but in my opinion, and I'm not accusing you of this at all.
No.
But I will accuse your college professors of this maybe. It's like the obsession on Reagan, I think, is on the obsession on sort of like pointing out the negatives of Reagan, I think is out of context with the way that we would talk about, John F. Kennedy is like lionized and still to this day as this like Camelot person, icon of Camelot. And then Reagan, and I think this is also where a lot of times conservatives, talk about liberal bias and we can't get ahead. Doesn't matter what we do. We might as well elect. I won't say his name.
Yeah. We have people very clearly supporting someone that they don't consider to be, that can easily be argued to not be a conservative, because allegedly that person is the only one who can defend conservative values. It's crazily ironic. I mean, it's just like, how does that even make sense?
Well, and the other thing too is when Reagan was president, there was a complete liberal media monopoly. I mean, Rush Limbaugh didn't come on the air till 1988.
Yep.
Fox News didn't come on the air till 1996. RedState.com didn't start till 2003 or 4. There wasn't the blogosphere. There wasn't Twitter. There wasn't Newsmax TV, you had the Washington Post and New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, right? So Reagan had pretty much a complete, no, they weren't left wing, but they were liberal. So you had an entire monopoly. The liberal media had an entire monopoly. And yet Reagan wins twice. He wins 49 states in 1984. And yet I'm supposed to believe that it's impossible for us to win, us meaning conservatives to win, unless we elect a thrice married reality star. I don't buy it. And I know times have changed, but in many ways they've changed for the better if you're trying to advance a conservative message.
Let's talk about that conservative message. I know we don't have enough time to do justice to this, but last time I talked to you, we kind of got into the realm of trying to kind of define what conservative values are. And you've kind of come out straight up as saying, when you're being authentic and you're doing your best job as a commentator, you just try to support conservative values regardless of party. At this point, you don't care whose jersey you're wearing. Not that you're likely at all to vote for a Democrat, because it simply doesn't seem likely they're going to run a candidate who you could ethically support. So what for you would you like to see in a conservative leader, if one could emerge that could say, get the nomination of the Republican Party?
I mean, yeah, the problem I have is I can't vote for Democrats because of policy. We just disagree fundamentally on public policy and my worldview. And I can't vote for Republicans because of character and decency. And so if the question is Republicans, that's where it is. You just have to be a decent, honest, honorable person. You have to have character. You can't engage in conspiracy theories. You can't engage in racism or xenophobia. And you can't stoke those things to get ahead and exploit those things. You can't make the world a worse place through your rhetoric. So I'm in this really horrible no man's land, of being homeless.
what needs, what do you believe would need to happen in the conservative movement and or in the Republican Party for you to feel like you had a new house?
Well, at this point, I think that what has to happen is Republicans would probably have to lose several elections. They would have to be punished before they would be willing to change. It's like, nobody changes until they have to, right? It's like the
Mhm.
alcoholism. There's the denial and all that, but at some point maybe you hit rock bottom and then you have to change. And so
Would that be would that have to take a midterm and a presidential election, or do you think that just the midterm will do?
unfortunately, I think it will take multiple losses before they will. I mean, think of it. They've already, I mean, we have a political party who just lost the presidency, lost the House during the midterms, lost the Senate because of the unmentioned president, and their response is give us more of that. Like, why they're not ready to change yet? So it's going to take, sadly, and I hate this because that means that the other side is going to be running up the score in terms of public policy victories. But I think before the Republican Party is willing to admit that they have a problem, they're going to have to go through more pain.
Absolutely. And you don't have, you're really, Matt, I want to tell you as a human being, I respect you, okay? Like you don't have your work cut out for you. Like you practiced courage in my estimation the last 4 years in refusing to kowtow to the party over a person who lacked character and also didn't even support any of your philosophical or policy perspectives either, ironically. But also, now you're in a position where your main job is to criticize the party who is going to be in power that's not your party of choice. So you went from, you know, losing friends in your coalition to looking at, at least 4 years of being a critic, because the only icing I can see, or not the icing, but it would be the icing on the shit cake that I can see for you in the next 4 years is that in your critique of the Democratic Party, you'll be kind of essentializing what it is that conservatism is and what it needs. Would that be a fair assessment of what you're looking at?
Yeah, I think that's. I'm in critic mode. I'm criticizing the left and the administration, even the Biden administration, when I think they deserve it. Simultaneously, I'm criticizing um, the clown car on the right when they deserve it, which is pretty much every day. But if I can, while I'm doing that, if I can impart some wisdom or ideas or help try to persuade people to see my philosophy, then that's icing on the cake. That gives me like a purpose driven life. That gives me. I'm not just writing. I'm also teaching a little bit and trying to persuade a little bit. There's a quote. It's like a novel from Tom Stoppard that Charles Krauthammer used to cite, which is like he says, like, I believe in the power of words. I don't think a writer can like change the world, but every once in a while you can nudge it. And so that's to me that's the best I can. If I can just nudge it a little bit every once in a while, then it's a good gig.
Well, let me give you just one more chance to nudge it a little bit in this conversation. Why don't you tell me, just as a takeaway, what is it about Reagan's conservatism that you thought was superb, and what would you like to preserve from that era and from Reagan's presidency?
Oh, I'm a fan. As the man says in Office Space about Michael Bolton. I'm a fan of his whole catalog, like I'm a fan of everything about Reagan, pretty much, with a couple of exceptions. But I would say the leadership is so important. I was on Morning Joe last week, and it was like the Monday after the Super Bowl, and they were going around talking about Tom Brady, and everyone's saying like what a good quarterback he is. And then they came to me and asked me about politics, so I didn't get to talk about Tom Brady. But
Of
in
course.
my opinion, what makes Tom Brady great, like, it's not just that he's a very good quarterback, but he's a leader. Like, he went to Tampa Bay, to a team that's not that great, and said, like, let me tell you how we're going to do this. And I want you to buy in on this. You're going to be great. You're going to go to the Super Bowl. You're going to win the Super Bowl if you do this. And he gets other people to rise to the occasion, other people to believe in themselves. It's just leadership. That's what Reagan had, leadership. The other thing I would bring up is the rhetoric. And I do believe that words matter. Barack Obama said, don't tell me words don't matter. I have a dream. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I would have added, tear down this wall, or slip the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. In the tear down this wall example, you had Reagan showing moral clarity. In the slip the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God, that's the Challenger disaster speech. And that's Reagan, I think, using poetry and also empathy and healing the nation. Like, those are things that a nation needs. We need moral clarity, that there are absolutes, there are rights and wrongs. It's not moral relativism. They were the evil empire. We're the good guys. And we also need to heal this country. And those are two things that Reagan did in many ways that the other Republican president that I'm not mentioning did the opposite, actually. He engaged in moral relativism. Everybody, remember, someone said, like, well, Putin kills people, and Trump said, there, I said his name. We almost made it. Putin kills people, and Trump said, well, we kill, you don't think we kill people? Who's being naive now, Kay? Essentially is what he said. So it's all about your truth. What's your truth? The 74 million voters believe that he won the election. I don't care what they believe. What are the facts? Who did win? So leadership, moral clarity, healing, compassion, all those things, and sorely missed by Republicans.
Matt Lewis, thanks for taking the time to speak to Curiosity Now.
Thank you, Aaron. It was great.